for coming. Hi, Bowie.
Yeah.
And what I actually want to do today, if we can, and I kind of wish that you weren't set up in the way that you're set up. I want to make this presentation somewhat informal, and I want audience participation. I want to encourage people to ask questions during the talk. I want to encourage people to offer their own stories, their own experiences as I talk about what I'll be talking about, so that we can try and actually begin to develop what I actually say here, communities. Because one of the things that I think is really critical in science education right now, be it at the university level or at the K-12 level or even outside of the formal classroom, is partnerships, or our partnerships, and really beginning to think more clearly, perhaps, and more explicitly about how we can actually form those types of communities. And I don't think that we can have those types of communities unless we actually engage in conversation and engage in talking with each other. And Bob has decided that he's going to do my session for me, which is perfect. And so please don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't hesitate to interject as I go through. And so Joe's absolutely right. First off, I want to actually thank him because I wouldn't actually be here if it hadn't been for Joe, because he's absolutely right. I went to NSTA trying to figure out what was I actually going to do with my life as such, and I stumbled upon him. I told him what I was looking for, and he said, well, why don't you come down to Michigan at the time and talk about your work. And so I did. His group there then learned about zebrafish embryos and early embryonic events during that time. And then after that, I started to work with people in his group and teachers in Detroit, and it was absolutely amazing. But what I want to talk about today is sort of a continuation of that work. In that when I went to University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, 2 hours south of Chicago, we are definitely not to be confused with Chicago. Champaign-Urbana, it's a little itty-bitty. What I've actually been doing down there is really work where I'm trying to bridge different communities, where I'm actually trying to bring people from the sciences, people from the College of Ed, and then from the public schools together to create the type of learning environments that we're all trying to create. So today I want to specifically talk about a project that's called PAGES. And PAGES simply stands for Progressing Through the Ages, Global Change, Evolution, and Societal Well-Being. And so that actually, those topics are really the focus of the units that we're trying to develop. It's a NIH-funded grant, similar to Reni's grant here. So I really want to give a call out or a shout out to NIH for funding this type of work. The goal of the grant really focuses on curriculum development, professional development, and working with people together. But before I actually start and talking about the projects, I really wanted to give a little bit of a background of, maybe a little bit more background of who I am and why I'm actually here, and where I think that one of the reasons why I actually think this work is important. And so as a kid, I was always given the opportunity to experience science. During summers, we oftentimes had a microscope on the porch, and we were encouraged to go down to a creek and bring samples up and look under the microscope and really sort of explore things. It was this sense of wonder that I think was cultivated by my parents in all of my siblings and myself, that I think sort of pushed me into thinking about science and really pushed me into doing what I'm doing now. And when I was putting together the talk and thinking about things, I had written down on one of the slides a sense of wonder. And I, for some reason, remembered that Rachel Carson actually had an essay that she wrote back in, there's two different dates, one's 1965 and one's 1956, but it was an essay that she wrote that she called, the 65 version of it was called A Sense of Wonder. And this is actually just a couple sentences from this essay that she wrote, where she actually talks about the importance of wondering and of being able to, she doesn't say this, but being able to, turn over a rock or go down on a beach and listen to the waves, listen to what's actually happening, the birds calling and things of that sort, and really wonder about what's going on in the natural world and really begin thinking about why we're here, why we're doing this. And I thought it was great that, that she actually points out that this sense of wonder needs to be so indestructible that it would last throughout a life as an unfailing antidote against the boredom and disenchantment of later years, the sterile preoccupation of all things that are artificial, alienation from the sources of our strength. Which, she wrote this in, the 50s. It's still true today, I think, and maybe even more so. She also goes on to this point that she says he, but it could be a she, needs the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with him the joys, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in. And that adult could be a teacher, that adult could be a parent, that adult could be, anyone. But the thing that I think is interesting, and the thing that maybe is something that we all need to think about, is that this adult needs to also have this sense of wonder. And that we need to really think about how we can engender and how we can actually have our teachers, as well as, us, really have that sense of wonder. And so that's one of the things that I hope that the Pages curriculum and Pages project will actually do, and that the end product of this work that we're doing is hopefully a series of curriculum materials that can be used in classrooms that will actually help facilitate that sense of wonder, but that also through the development of the materials and the professional development and the use of the materials, teachers too will have that sense of wonder. So just to sort of continue thinking about Pages and why Pages and why the work that we're actually doing, so Pages is focusing around science literacy, around what people call controversial topics. I put those in quotes because I don't think that they should be controversial topics. And I'm actually quite horrified that they're still considered controversial topics. Ideas of evolution, I don't think I need to say more. The ideas of climate change and the implications of climate change, again, I think we really need to think about what's going on. Pages actually goes one step further in that the science that we're actually thinking about, or the science we were thinking about when we wrote the grant, is that we were really interested in designing curriculum materials at the intersection of those two ideas, because they can't be and they shouldn't be really considered independent, in that there are implications of climate change for evolution as well as vice versa, and sort of thinking about those two together is something that we were really interested in thinking about. I'd like to, and perhaps this is me being a tad naive, I'd like to actually say that through learning through these materials, yes?
So you said to ask questions?
Yes, absolutely.
I will ask questions just so get us started. I really like the wondering page and the way you talked about it, because you said you had a microscope.
Yeah.
And you would go down and you'd bring,
Yeah.
you'd look at stuff. So that wondering page is all about kids experiencing and phenomena, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe you're going to get to this, but now that I go to the pages, the next page, these are topics. These are not phenomena.
Right.
Right. So I just I'm not going to wonder about. I guess once you build up knowledge of evolution, you can wonder about it, but it's not a puzzle that you're going to wonder about, right? It's a topic or a big idea, as you said, or a core idea, but they're not.
Right.
So is Pages about phenomena or is Pages about topics? I guess that's my question.
So that's a great question, and I think we'll get to it more, but I would say, much like I told people earlier, that I'll be honest, okay? This talk, I'll be honest. If you ask me questions, I'll give you my honest opinion. And and so some of my answers might be, I don't know. But I think that in response to your question is that these are topics. I totally agree with you that what I have up here are topics. But Pages is about, and the curriculum design model that we're using is about identifying phenomenon and phenomena that we can actually use to engender the wonder, to engender the questioning, and to get the questioning that begins to get students an understanding, or that helps allow students to develop an understanding of these big topics. So I think that there's a tension, or there's a tension for me in a couple things that I do is do you start with the topic or the concept that you're interested in figuring out, or when you're thinking about curriculum development? Or do you start with the interesting idea, phenomenon, and let that take you where it would actually go? So I think there's potential tensions. And when we were writing the grant, thinking about the audience, and this is where I'm being truthful, thinking about the audience that would be reading the grant, that presenting it as these are the next generation science standards that we're interested in addressing. They are, can be grouped into these categories, and that we will use, the storyline approach. We'll use a phenomenon-based approach to design a curriculum to get there. Is the approach we took. So I think it's not a either or. So this is a long-winded answer. It's not an either or. I think it goes both ways.
I was just going to say that's what we should start with standards.
She's just looking at me. I thought she was saying something else, but nonetheless, she's disagreeing with you. So.
Yeah. So I would dearly love it if we could just find an interesting phenomenon and go down that road. I would love that. Hyenas eating something might be the phenomena, or chasing down something might be. But to go back to what I have here. But yes, please, thank you for that question, and other people, please do ask questions. I actually do want to the other thing that I have here is sort of this productive dissonance about decisions that we make. In that we learn about climate change, or we learn about evolution, yet what is the implications of that in our lived experiences and in our everyday life? I've told some people, I'm in the market for a new car. What type of new car do I actually buy? Do I buy a car? And there's different criteria, right? And I need to think about all of these different things, and there's pros and cons to everything. And so how do I actually make that decision, that informed decision, evidence-based decision? How do I actually do that around that particular example, which could be linked back to climate change or things of that sort? Pages is also part of this larger effort, similar to what you all are doing here, focused on science teaching and learning, trying to think about how do we actually support teachers? How do we support students as well in learning and engaging in the types of science that we're asking them to engage in? And then finally, as I've alluded to and actually said, I want to figure out ways, or the Pages is trying to identify ways that actually make links between a number of different groups of people. So how do we actually, as scientists, how do we work with science educators and work with teachers in a collaborative manner to actually get the types of units, get the type of learning that we actually are interested in? The teachers that I have up here, one of the things that Pages has actually allowed me to do is not only work with in-service teachers, but I've also been able to pull a few pre-service teachers in. And so that's been an interesting sort of trajectory for these students or for these teachers. First when they're on campus as a pre-service teacher, and then as they move out into the field as in-service teachers. So why collaboration? I could be sitting down in my office and I could sit and write the curriculum myself. So why am I actually pushing, or why does Pages actually push on this idea of collaboration? And so these are just sort of three large categories of trying to provide the rationale for why science collaboration. First off, science is collaborative. The practice of science is collaborative. And so trying to model that for the students as well in the development of the units, I think is important as well. Teaching can also be thought of as collaborative. I would make the argument that teaching needs to be collaborative. Teaching maybe sometimes isn't collaborative, but it really needs to be collaborative in the sense that teachers are working with students. They need to understand those students, and you need to understand them from a range of perspectives. So that's one way of thinking about collaboration in teaching. But there's also another way of thinking about collaboration within teaching, and that actually is thinking about, you have teachers and students and community organizations and people all working together in a collaborative manner to try and ensure that the learning is actually occurring and that things are actually happening. And that then brings me to this last point, that your learning itself is a collaborative effort between teachers and students, or between the different people involved. And one of the things I'm sure you have heard about or heard that, though I want to put a little twist about on it, is that the new standards are really asking students and teachers to shift from learning about science to figuring things out. And the figuring things out, I actually want to be purposeful about using things in this instance. Because it could be the hyenas, or it could be, the rocks or things of that sort. It's, these things that we're actually figuring out in order to understand the science that's underlying it. And then finally, in thinking about learning, thinking about how in this type of learning, and this type of collaborative learning, you actually get a formation of a community of learners. So I've sort of given you a rationale or a justification of what Pages is trying to do. But then how do we actually do it? What do we actually do? And how can we actually learn from this? And so there's two things that and how do we actually develop the type of learning environments or curriculum materials that Pages has as a goal. And so what I actually want to argue, or what I want to propose to do, is actually take this idea of a community of practice and look at, use that construct and use that framework to actually look back and to look at how we're doing curriculum development and implementation from this community of practice idea, and to see how and what can we actually learn by doing this? And is there then ways for us to think about what we learn as we move forward? And so here, and why do I actually want to do this? Is it because I think that using this community of practice framework actually foregrounds the social interactive processes that I talked about in the previous slide about learning. And it also lets us think about learning in terms of both the science that we're interested in doing, as well as thinking about the teaching. And so what is a community of practice, and why am I thinking about community of practice? So Wenger actually defines, and others have defined, community of practice as having three sort of core parts, and that's the domain, the community, and the practice. And here I've just taken some quotes actually from his website and from a publication that he has that talks about the introduction of what a community of practice is to highlight what I'm actually thinking and what I'd like to use as I move forward in sharing with you what I'm actually doing with the Pages project. So the domain is simply this identity defined by a shared domain of interest. And so here in Pages, it started out as being curriculum development and thinking about the design of learning environments, thinking about how do we actually get students how do we actually provide an opportunity for students to actually learn the science that we want them to. The community is simply the members engaged in this effort. And so in this instance, it would be the scientists, science educators, teachers, and ideally the students as well. And then the practice is the shared repertoire of resources or activities, things that you actually do in order to get to the end goal. So in Pages, as I just said, we initially identified a domain. So the domain here would be it could be viewed as the design of the learning environment and around a specific science area. We brought together individuals, so we brought together a range of teachers, we brought together scientists, we brought together teacher educators, grad students, and we sort of gave them a task, and we began to think about what scaffolds or supports would be actually needed in order to begin to develop the materials. And so what I'd actually like to talk to you for the rest of the time today, and what were the different aspects of the community of practice that was established or not, and modified or not over time. So what were sort of the characteristics or qualities of the communities that actually came out of this work? And then looking into the future, what I'm actually interested in doing is what are the which of these models, if there is a model, is sustainable and in what ways. So just to give you very briefly, just a little bit more background of what Pages actually is. So I told you it was called Progressing Through the Ages, Global Change, Evolution, and Societal Wellbeing. It is actually funded through, yes?
Sorry, could you go back to the previous one? I was wondering if you could give a little bit more information on examples of the scaffolds or supports you use to establish practices with the teachers.
Can you wait for, and I'll talk about that. Sort of the professional development that we offered, and through the professional development, what sort of routines did we actually establish? What sort of structures for actually coming up with activities and things of that sort in the design of curriculum types of things. And if you have other ideas for me to turn around and implement, I would love to. But yeah, I'll talk more.
So Barbara, I think I have the domain, right? Because
Yeah.
the domain is how do you develop curriculum materials that align with NGSS or something.
Yes,
I think I got your community practice. I think I got the people
right?
in your community of practice, right? It's teachers, it's researchers. What are the practices?
So that's what she was.
Well,
Well, that's a kind of.
She has the scaffolds.
Well, but specific to the. So here, what the practices of actually I would make an argument that the practice of actually coming together during summer to sit and struggle through identifying a phenomenon that would actually be productive, and actually using the different tools, curriculum development tools that we actually have, and critiquing that would be an example of a practice. So the coming together, the engaging in the curriculum design, and then sharing and turning around and using that in their classroom and talking about that would be the practices. And if it's perfectly fine to say no, that's not. Think about it. I mean, this is.
Figure out what you mean by it. So.
Yeah. Anyone else? Other people? So the shared practice of thinking, thinking critically about what entails or what is sort of, curriculum that actually addresses the three dimensions of the three dimensions of the standards. Thinking about that, being willing and able to critique that, and those types of things would be what the practice of. I did say this is preliminary stuff, and so if there are issues or if they're going, this doesn't work, let me know, and I'll see if I can give a justification. So, as I said, so it's funded through a Science Education Partnership Award. It was first awarded in 2016, or was awarded in 2016. So we're in the third year of a 5-year grant. This just sort of describes or shows what it is that we actually wanted to do. So it is, the project itself is actually K-12. And so when we wrote the grant, we actually said that we would actually design units in each of the grade bands, and that they would be coherent units or units that build off of each other and link to each other across the K-12 span. We also said that we would actually be doing sort of 2 learning progressions and thinking about 2 learning progressions. One which was going to focus on range shifts, novel ecological interactions, vector-borne disease, and evolution. And then the second one we said would focus on phenotypic variation, developmental genetics, and development, genetics, plasticity, and evolution. And so as Joe pointed out, these would be more topics. They're not actually the phenomenon that we turned around and used. One of the findings, one of the things that I can say out of the grant right from now is that we were overly ambitious, and we will not actually get to this part. We will not finish our 2 learning progressions by the time we actually get to the end of the grant. But that's what it is.
Barbara,
Yes.
will you be doing K-12
Yes.
in one of the?
I will show, we're a little bit of opportunistic in that we have started to develop units that are in all of, we have units that are represented in both of the progressions. We won't have one coherent one, and that actually is something I got pushback from teachers when we started initially developing, and I have it'll be, I'll show you. So this is just a slide which I realize that you probably can't see, but it sort of outlines what we actually thought we would actually be doing. In that, when we got the grant, and so people on campus, we then sat down, we tried to figure out what we wanted to actually do. We came up with bundles of performance expectations and things of that sort. And then what we wanted to actually do is we wanted to move into this cycle of where we would have teacher institutes, where we would pull people together to develop curriculum. We would then go into sort of enactment cycles and then circle back around to curriculum review and redesign and things of that sort. We had, and we do have, we had proposed in the narrative of the grant to actually design online professional development using the NGSX system as well. And then once we go through a couple iterations of this cycle, we would then be sort of at the top, and we would go out of the circle and work on dissemination and things of that sort. So these are we have 6-ish units right now under development. We have one elementary unit that's looking at life cycles and inheritance. How do we all grow up? And the opening phenomenon in that one is actually a Mayfly Emergence. So mayflies emerge and mayflies die, all in a very short period of time. And they leave a big pile of stuff. They're dead. So they are there. What's going on? How's it going on? And so that unit is actually being developed. How do chickens become eggs or other living things? The opening phenomenon is actually a chicken egg. And wondering, what part of the phenomenon is more complex than this, wondering how does the chicken egg actually give rise to a chick? Or will it give rise to a chick? Because not all eggs actually do. Another unit, another middle school unit, why are dogs getting sick? And this is getting at heartworm, and students explore in this unit where are the dogs, and this idea of vector-borne disease, and dogs getting bit by mosquitoes, things of that sort. There's a genetics unit of why aren't kids the exact same as their parents, and so that's just compare and contrast of that. 2 images as such. High school units, we have 2 high school units. Why are these kids getting sick, and how can I avoid getting sick? And this is actually about Lyme disease. We had a teacher, part of the early project development, who was actually from Vermont, and she was really interested in Lyme. And it turned out that one of the graduate students who was working on the project was an entomology student focusing on tick biology. And so the two of them got together and developed this unit. So it's about the ecosystem biology underlying Lyme disease. And then finally we have an animal communication type of unit of why are males so showy? And so getting at the issue of display and communication and things like that. We've piloted all these units, though we've not piloted them all equally, and we've had different uptake by teachers for some of these different units, some more so than others. And we're right now, probably like many of you in the room, we're thinking about teacher institutes for this upcoming year. Yeah, Rini.
Can you talk just a little bit more about the teachers? Are they from one district? Are they from, geographically, where are they from? Or do you have a slide maybe?
I don't, and I thought of having that slide. So that's actually a really interesting question, and I think that actually it actually goes into this idea of a community of practice, in that when we initially, year one, what we did is that we went to our partner school districts, and teachers actually came, and so they were for the most part close to the university. They were for the most part, they all knew each other as such. Having said that, that's not what we have maintained, in that some of the units have maintained that closeness, but we've also expanded for some of the units. We've expanded actually into the Chicago area with teachers to develop the unit through partnerships, just in part to get additional teachers, but also in part because the partnership with Northwestern, so we had access to more teachers. So that was actually sort of central. Other things is that we've also started pulling in teachers who have reached out to us because of interest in NGSS and through the networks that are actually there. The other thing that we've recognized, or the other thing that's actually happened, is that some of the high school teachers fell away. They were there for the first summer of development, but the vast majority of the high school teachers chose not to continue with us into the subsequent years. And I think there was many reasons as to why that happened, of which one I will show in a slide. But yeah. So this then, looking across the 3 years of the project, what can we actually learn about the creation of the communities of practice? And so what I've done is I've started to look through field notes and observations, teacher surveys, as well as interviews to begin doing this type of analysis. So sort of preliminary findings of what I've actually seen is I would actually make the argument that there's multiple communities of practices that are actually arising out of this work, in that there's one that's focused around the ideas of curriculum development, and then there's one that's arising out of curriculum enactment. And I actually think that we have those two, they're overlapping, and members from one can be in the other, but I actually think the practices that they're actually engaging in and the things that they're actually doing are giving rise to two unique communities. And then the other thing that, the other two bullet points, perhaps not surprising, not all are actually as strong as the other. And I think there's a number of reasons as to why that's actually occurring, and I'll talk about some of those here. Other questions before I move in? So in looking at what I've actually found, or what we're seeing around this idea of community practice around curriculum development itself. So these are just 4 sort of large areas that actually are coming out of thinking about this. This idea of ownership, I think, is key. And I think this idea of ownership actually it can be seen across ideas of domain, the community as well, and practice. So I think you see that across all of these different areas. Specific to the domain focus is the focus of the domains, or the focus of the curriculum unit shifted and actually took time to develop. And specifically, I want to focus on that one. Communities obviously benefited from, the community development benefited from a range of experience and expertise. And if you didn't have that sort of diversity of both experience and expertise, I think that the communities tended to flounder and not work so well. And then regarding the practice, meetings between members were actually very important so that they could actually develop a shared understanding of this curriculum development as they move forward.
Barbara?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more? Your first moment is that ownership of development matters across the three areas.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by what do you mean that it matters?
Okay, can I use this as an example? Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, so the teachers needed to have ownership in what was actually being developed and what was actually going to be an outcome of the materials. And that, so when I went to recruit teachers, Becky and I went to, when we're writing this grant, we got letters of support from the districts, and the district said, of course we'll send our teachers. But then when push came to shove and we got the money and we needed to start recruiting teachers to actually come to the workshops, we had to go and sell it again, right? And so I recruited teachers came, but teachers knew that they were going to be learning about next generation science standards. They knew that they were going to be developing curriculum materials that addressed the large concepts that I actually, or topics that I actually showed earlier, but they didn't have more say in what they were actually developing than that. I think that I know I made a mistake when I then, I created bundles of performance expectations that I thought would create really neat units. And I still think they probably would create really neat units. But the teachers did not think that they would create really neat units. And so, but the teachers are great teachers. And so they sat for that first summer, they learned about the next generation science standards, they engaged in activities, and we developed our own sort of community of practice. And then they went into curriculum development mode, and they started working through and coming up with things. And for the most part, they actually left with something that you could see as a first draft of some materials or ideas of where you would actually go to. I mean, they weren't perfect, and we didn't expect things to be perfect, and we were going to spend the next year revising and things of that sort. One middle school group sort of disappeared. I never heard from them again. But then I went back to them, to one of the teachers, and I actually said, let's revisit. Let's really think about how we can actually create some materials that would be useful for you, that would actually be good for you. And this was actually a quote from one of the teachers in that group, where afterwards she was talking to the person who was doing the interview, which was not me, where the teacher actually said, Barbara made me feel better in the second summer when she said that she had screwed up, that she had just assigned us standards. And I actually did. I mean, I actually went to the school, met with the group of teachers, and said that that it wasn't working, and that I might have actually used the words that I had screwed up. But this teacher didn't have any ownership in the materials. She was willing to give me her time and effort during the summer, but she wasn't willing to go further. She didn't continue in things until I actually went to her and said, okay, so how can we actually make it so that it works for you? And so we actually sat down with their curriculum. This is what I should have done from the start. We sat down with the school district's curriculum to actually see what were the standards that she actually needed to address, and how we could actually use some of those standards to actually address the goals of the grant. And so when we did that, she and the other teachers in this group, along with the university folk, have now actually created the heartworm unit, or why are dogs getting sick? And so that's the one example. So that's an example of what I mean by ownership matters. And I think that's also the reason why the high school teachers have dropped out for the most. I mean, there's other reasons why I think they dropped out, but I think one of the reasons why they dropped out is that they weren't vested in the materials that they didn't have any ownership in the materials that they were actually developing. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So are the standards that you're using, aren't they the same standards that they're supposed to be covering? Because
Yes. So the standards so we are using the next generation science standards, and these are the standards that the state of Illinois has adopted, the next generation science standards. But what's actually happening is that there's so the state of Illinois has left it up to the districts as to what they actually do and how they actually do it, much like other schools or other states. So the standards that I thought would actually be a good bundle were standards that this teacher did not address in her year of curriculum type of thing. Some districts, too, are choosing to not cover all the standards, and so that was also another issue. Other questions?
So Barbara, isn't that a different story? I mean, so one of the things we learned early on when you were at this IC was that working with the district's learning goals was really important. So it wasn't necessarily that you created a bundle, it was that you created a bundle that didn't match their learning goals. Right, so if they're not gonna teach it in their classroom, I mean, it's like, it seems different to me. Like if you would've picked a bundle that matched what they wanted to do, that seems like it would be different than picking a bundle that doesn't match what they want to do.
Yes and no. I mean, if I were to actually go back and compare the performance, and this is, I need to do this in order to answer your question. I would need to look at the performance expectations that I gave her to see if those are in fact ones that are in her curriculum or not. Was she not just telling me that they weren't, or were they in fact not in there? So I don't know. They didn't fit. Right. But I also think that it was the fact that I went there and asked her to give her input, I think also was the ownership bit. So I would say both are important, but I think ownership is also important. Yeah.
So couldn't there be another lesson for this that's along the lines of quality matters? I'm thinking about the work that we do on developing curricula like interactions or carbon time and things like that. And the thing that teachers are making a judgment about is not whether they own the curriculum, it's whether the curriculum is good enough to do something that they need to do. And so, and when you start out with something that's kind of vague, they can end up concluding it doesn't meet my expectations in terms of doing something that I need to do. And the solution is to have a better developed curriculum or to involve them from earlier in the process. Either one of those strategies could potentially work.
Yes, I think that, and I think that the last one, the involving them, kind of like what Joe is saying, involving them in the identification of the learning standards or the next generation standards is key. I would agree with you. And I think that I made assumptions as a university faculty person who just was given this grant that I can go to teachers and say, let's work together and do this. But I missed that first part of the really working together and actually identifying things that they saw relevant and something that they wanted to do.
So are you arguing that interactions is not going to work as a curriculum?
No. And would not argue that carbon time wouldn't work as a curriculum either, because I think that, and that actually I would make the argument is that there's a second sort of, or a different type of community of practice around, though, perhaps around established curriculum materials and things of that sort that teachers have decided do fit the goals that they actually need. But that involving teachers in the development process, if you really want to see it through to the end, it's really important that at the start there's buy-in, that they have this ownership and things of that sort.
Okay, so you're separating development from enactment.
Yes,
saying during
yes.
development. Okay.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and I think that that's actually one of the things that sort of surprised me is that I think that there are two different, at least two, but here there are sort of two different types of communities, and that sometimes the teachers in those two communities are different types of teachers. And I think trying to work with the strengths of the teachers and the desires of the teachers, I think, is really important. David.
So one of the things I'm curious if the teachers talked about, because something we find in our work is, especially from like a community of practice framing, so you're talking about cultural shifts, you're talking about changing participation, you're talking about tools, and to have those things change requires time, and it requires a lot of, it's beyond just sort of one resource or one tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we see in some of our work, and I'd be curious if your teachers too, is a unit is not enough to shift the culture of a classroom or the culture of teaching. So they can see that, like within a unit, I understand that we want kids to do different work, I understand the need to be a different teacher, but when that unit is over, then I gotta go back and lecture to kids because we have to cover all the stuff we couldn't cover when we were doing this work, right? So I'm wondering if some of them talked about the tension between like a single unit as placing the hopes of transformation on versus a different sort of shift around what counts as teaching and learning in a classroom.
So that's a great question, and it's one that I can't answer. Because when we went in with this project, we didn't promise a whole year-long curriculum or things of that sort. And we did not actually ask the teachers, or I don't think we asked the teachers about these other things. So I can't answer that question. But I would agree with you. And I think that that's something that's really important to think about, is that, and I think you're seeing this now on Twitter, where teachers are asking, where are these resources? How can I actually do this? High school, I've been asked by Champaign High School, that they're in a curriculum adoption cycle and they're looking for materials, and what materials would you use? And finding this unit is not sufficient because they need to have the whole year and things of that sort. So I think that that's actually a big tension.
Can I ask, so with respect to David's question, you mentioned at the beginning, and I think maybe all proposals are like this, you propose something and then you begin to do it and you're like, oh crap, that's way too big, shoot. But thinking about his question, if you were going to go back knowing what you know now and propose perhaps
Right.
something that you didn't necessarily think they would.
Pie in the sky, pie in the sky.
What is the sort of chunk that you would want to do in 5 years? You know what I mean? Would it be one progression in 2 grade bands, or would it be one progression in 1 grade band, or something different?
So I think it would really matter who the teachers are that I'm actually working with. Because I think that from a conceptual sort of thinking type of activity, I think it would be really interesting to design a series of what we propose. I think designing a series, maybe for one learning progression, to design a series of units that would actually allow students from going across K-12 actually see the materials see an approach to the performance expectations that make sense in a coherent sort of way. I think that's an interesting intellectual activity. I'm not certain that it's a terribly practical or maybe even worthwhile activity at this point, unless you have, as Andy pointed out, the surrounding materials for other materials. Because I think it's extremely frustrating for both teachers and students when you shift from one type of teaching to another type of teaching. You're pulling What's that?
It's been our experience.
That's our
Yeah.
experience. in this.
Yeah. I mean, you're pulling the rug out from under them, is what it
The
is.
teachers too.
Yeah.
Like they do our units and then they're given something by the district to do and they go, this is terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying.
No.
Of course, ours are great. No.
Which one's terrible?
Of course, ours are great,
That was not a
but
call
the
here.
other materials that are available, like online
Right.
materials and
Right.
that they get assigned, they
Right.
said, oh, we're supposed to use these online
Right.
units that
Right.
really aren't science,
Right.
so.
Right, which is why, so in an earlier conversation that I had today with Rini and Edith and Consuelo, I was actually proposing this idea of the need to have sort of this repository of materials that teachers or districts could have access to and actually use in in a easily understandable manner. And that I don't think, I mean, I have materials on, the Pages website. Joe has materials on the Interaction site. Andy has it on Carbon Time site. And if you are sort of in and if you know, you can find all these materials. But if you're a teacher who's just finished a unit and you're looking for another unit to do, you have no idea where to go.
Go ahead, Deborah.
No, I was gonna change the subject, so if you wanna ask
No,
about that.
but I also think it's gotta be coherence.
Yeah.
So just because you have one good NGSS unit, you can't necessarily pick up another NGSS unit. They somehow have to build on each other, or someone has to make that connection. So it's not just, at least from my experience, that's what I'm gonna argue, right? That somehow the field has to get together, and it's not, I can take this one, I can take this and this one, and just put them there. Even then, I think there's gonna be a bit of difficulty for teachers and difficulties for students.
So I agree, with the exception, teachers are asking me, what do I do next, right now? And I think under, in ideal
Something's better than
circumstances,
nothing.
something, but I think that something needs to be quality. So I mean, I think that they really need to be quality, because I think that one can also do damage by giving teachers half-finished materials or materials that you don't want, whatever. So I think there needs to be some balance in that sense. But I think that if I think I would make the argument that if the science ed community doesn't identify a way of sharing resources, coherent or otherwise, people are going to get frustrated and potentially turned off from the next generation science standards. Maybe that's me being negative or pessimistic, I don't know. But I think that we need to attend to that issue. And think about coherency.
Yeah, it's not only coherence, for me, it's how people make use of discourse moves, right?
Right?
And they could be different in the different curricula, and that's just gonna mix both the teacher up and the student up, right? What to do. Maybe use of a driving question, one may have one, one may not have one, right? I mean, and so they both can be quality materials, but they don't necessarily gel together.
Yeah.
And I actually think the field needs to get together beforehand and try to figure out how they work together more,
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
talking about diverse communities.
Yeah, I think so too.
Could you talk a little bit more about the differences in the type of teachers in the two groups, of the development kind of teachers that work best in that kind of a group, and the teachers that work better with materials that are already developed, and the kind of practices around
So-
those two?
So one of the things that I noticed in terms of the different types of, so what I noticed is that the community of practice around curriculum development, those teachers tend to also be present in the curriculum enactment professional, so there's that link. The new teachers in the curriculum enactment group oftentimes are young people with young kids at home. So they actually, from just a practical standpoint, they can't be part of the development because they have to deal with life issues and things of that sort. So that's one thing that I noticed. They also tend to be teachers who either aren't as familiar with the next generation science standards, or who believe that they're not as familiar with the next generation science standards. And so their level of comfort and sort of comfort seems to exclude them from the development cycle. Those would be the things. So this just sort of continues this idea of, how much more time do I have? Sorry.
29 minutes.
Okay. This slide here just sort of continues this idea of ownership, and that it goes to this idea of the importance of actually valuing contributions of all members. In that, if this, I believe that if and I saw this happening when someone didn't think that their contribution was valued, oftentimes they left. It didn't mean to say that they left the project, because I then also saw them coming back in during the enactment phase. But as if they didn't think that they were valued, if their ideas weren't being valued during the development phase, they actually stopped participating. The strong community of practice focusing around curriculum development actually had all members developing curriculum. And I saw this in the chicken unit. We had a big group of teachers who were participating from all over the state of Illinois and into Connecticut, actually. But they all participated. They all worked on things. They actually all did things. They had different roles that they could actually play. Whereas one of the high school units, they didn't have all of the members developing curriculum together. They had all the members giving feedback and comment, but there was this split ownership of the materials, in that one set of people was actually developing the curriculum and then providing the other for comment and feedback. And the comment and feedback people, they gave the comment and feedback, but it didn't give as strong of a community of practice feel to what was actually happening. And so that made me think about sort of the design of curriculum materials and how to actually do it perhaps in a more coherent, cohesive manner. And that then just sort of slips into this last bullet point, sort of thinking about top-down design process versus more of a collaborative curriculum development model. And there are going to be situations where you do one versus the other. I realize that teachers are busy. Teachers can't always really do all of the development, and some of the teachers choose not to do the development. But it was an interesting point that came out of thinking about this. Thinking about the actual community in the development cycle, the successful community to practice had a wide range of experience. It wasn't that they were all teachers, it wasn't that they were all scientists, and it wasn't that they were all science educators, but there was a diversity of experiences. And within each of those sort of categories as such, there's also diversity of experience, in that one of the, or two of the projects, or two of the units when they were developed actually had a mix of the pre-service teachers, and there was an interesting trajectory and mentoring that actually occurred in that whole development process, in that I had invited these pre-service teachers into the project. And then when they became first-year teachers, the project actually sort of coalesced around them, or their unit community of practice coalesced around them and actually provided provided a system for providing mentorship and help as they moved into the field of teaching. And there was other teachers often commented about how developing these units actually gave them additional opportunities to develop science content, as well as the knowledge of NGSS. So it wasn't one or the other. Teachers saw opportunities for both. And this just, again, sort of, it's a different aspect of the range of expertise, having different areas of expertise even within the teachers that were actually present, or the educators that were actually present. You saw the importance of having ranges of expertise in different areas. And these were just some of the ones that we saw as being important, or teachers actually mentioning, and an interesting one of them is actually talking about classroom norms or the discourse moves that are in the materials. So this then gets a little bit to the role of practice and what was actually happening in the practice. And it'll be interesting to see if this actually fits with this idea of practice. And so here there was the practice of actually meeting was actually something that came about as being important in the curriculum development groups. So there's multiple types of meetings, and they weren't just restricted to summertime. We had face-to-face meetings during the year as well as video conferencing. And working within the norms of the community was something that was actually really important. The norms had to be established, and then the norms were actually maintained and carried out during the various meetings and during work time that they actually had. And that then led to the ability of actually developing curriculum, because there were certain practices that had been established that let teachers or people actually express their views without feeling that they were going to be shot down. I mean, there was actually this sort of support system that had actually been put into place. This is just, the quote I have here is just one of the chicken teachers. She was actually one of the new teachers, first-year teacher, who's actually talking about the importance of materials and moving forward. So then thinking about around the enactment. So I had actually mentioned that I saw that there was actually these two different types of communities of practice being developed. And so these were just some of the initial findings that are coming out of looking at the data that we have about this. The domain was focused from the start, so that wasn't one that was actually changing. The teachers had decided that they were, going to be using the materials, and so they were really interested in thinking about, how do we actually get the support that we actually need around this particular unit. So this was different from the prior unit development domain. This one was, stayed on target as such from the start. Here again, honoring different roles was actually important to actually create a community. And I do actually put the word respectfully in there purposefully because we actually noticed that based on how teachers and other people within the group actually treated each other, things were more successful or less successful. And again, for practices, the meetings was sort of the key thing that came out. So this just goes a little bit more in depth with these different ideas. So the importance of honoring the roles, where everyone was actually treated as an equal. So it wasn't that you were a teacher and you were a university faculty member. It was that you were members within this group, that you happened to have different expertise, but you were still on equal footing. And that was actually important for the success of the different community. Different roles were assumed by different people at different times based on what was actually needed. And the thing that I actually thought was interesting was that a few of the enactment teachers, and I think this goes to Deborah's question perhaps about who was in which of these communities of practice, a few of the enactment teachers at times assumed more of a curriculum development role, where they actually created materials because they saw things that were missing in the materials, and a few of them actually sat down and designed lesson plans and said, here, why don't you try seeing if these could actually work and fit. But they couldn't be, or they weren't in the development cycle for a host of different reasons. But they were actually, though the teachers who were perhaps a little bit more removed from the process, they were in fact the ones who actually talked to us more about assessment, and who actually started talking about where and how can we actually do assessment more explicitly within the materials. And I don't know if that's because they didn't see what was already there in the unit as assessment, or if assessment was truly missing. So one of the things that I've learned through doing the project, and I want to keep moving forward, will make this something that's absolutely central to the professional development. It's this idea of the virtual study group. Not a new idea, other people are doing it as well, but it was instrumental to actually both developing the community of practice around this particular unit. In this instance here that I'm calling out is the chicken unit. But it's something that I think that really sort of created the community of practice because it gave them a meeting place. These teachers for this particular unit were across the state of Illinois, as well as in Michigan and in Connecticut. And so having this opportunity through which you could actually have weekly, and then it turned into every other week, meetings, I think was extremely important for these teachers. And so this type of, thinking about this type of thing has made me think about how do you actually use the community of practice that's established out of the enactment group to actually think about additional connections or becoming sort of distributing the curriculum materials. Because one of the things that we've noticed is that the enactment groups are actually forming bridges across each other. So you have the enactment group for the chicken group, and then you also have an enactment community that's formed around the heartworm unit. And in part because there are teachers that are overlapping, there seems to be sort of this networking type of activity that's actually occurring. And so how do you actually leverage that to give teachers additional support and then also a broader distribution of the curriculum if that's actually possible? And so these are just what I'd like to end with and maybe continue some questions. So one of the things that we found was that we did have these strong communities that came out of work that was actually done around specific units. And I do think that it really was the specific units. We didn't see it over all of the units. It was a few of the targeted units. And that potentially is having it to do with the makeup of the groups that were actually structured. The formation of the community, maybe this is obvious, it takes time and effort. It wasn't something that happened year one for all of the groups, but it was something that emerged and deepened over the 3 years so far. The community development, the community of practice around the curriculum development, I think allowed teachers to have buy-in about the materials that they were developing. And I think it also helped in the whole design process, leading to materials that more closely align to the intent of the standards. The weaker community of practices, they still designed units, but the alignment to the intent of the new standards, I don't think is actually as strong. And I mean, it's a correlation, it's not causative. And then interestingly, I think around the enactments, I think it actually it strengthened the teaching by the individual teachers. And so the community of practice really helped the end goal for these teachers. And I think that it will be interesting to see how, moving forward, as we move out of more of this development phase, and if some of the development teachers actually fade away or move on to other units, what actually happens in the enactment circle. Because one of the things that I'm thinking about is, how do you actually maintain these different communities of practice? And if the goal of the community of practice is done as such, you have the curriculum materials, it's sort of a what next? How do you actually evolve the community into the next step and move forward? And so this is just sort of alluding to some of that, but wanting to actually look to see, I say that I have these strong communities of practice. Does that actually end up with a stronger learning environment, and stronger learning environment being measured by what are kids actually learning, and what do you actually see is happening. And so then that is one of the things that I want to look to see if there is a correlation across these two ideas. Figuring out how to sustain the community of practice is something that I've started thinking about, and ideas would be great. And then more clearly identifying sort of lessons learned so that we can, in moving forward in the next design cycle or in the next grant, what is it that we can actually apply from having learned this one. So. And so any additional questions I'd be more than willing to answer. But before I actually do that, one of the things I actually want to do is just acknowledge co-PI Becky Fuller, who is a professor in the Department of Anabiology, as well as giving a huge thank you to the Pages teachers and the graduate students who have been working on the project. None of this would have been possible without them. And then to thank Brian Reiser and the Next Generation Storyline Group at Northwestern for the work that they're doing on thinking about the next generation NGSX and professional development materials as such for the Pages curriculum materials. So, and I'd be, my email is there, and so if you have any questions or want to keep talking, please don't hesitate to reach out.
So we still have 12 minutes for questions, so let's ask members about that. Well, we can thank her first. Please keep up the lead.
Yeah, Bowie.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
When you were presenting, I was like, this is another Joe Grayshot, or this is another high season working here at MSU. So I see the same story and same framework that I'm familiar with, and it's very good one, and I know it's a lot of work. So I have several questions, but I want to focus on one about the cultural differences in regard to teacher professional development and the spread of innovation. For example, here, I never see that an administration structure, I never see that the principal or some of this, but in China, that this is, or in Singapore, that this is quite obvious. Teachers get involved because there is a project, the principal that invited you to come in and had a commitment, might assign a couple of people that just taste this and work on this, and then they stick to the end. They opt in or opt out. And if something is very good, and then the principal will say, more teachers come in. So, and I think there are just pros and cons. And so for this one, I'm just saying how do you make use of the admin power or some of the structure, some of the things that from this hierarchy or this administration support to help you to spread your innovation better. So what is the situation?
So that's a great question, and I guess I would answer it initially, at least, is that when we wrote the grant, we did have the support of the administration from our partner districts. We had the obligatory letter saying that teachers were going to be participating, and all that and not. And when we went and said, we now have this money, let's have the teachers as such. The teachers came that first year for the grant, in part because I knew them and they knew me, but then they dropped out. And I'm painting it more black and white than it actually was, but they dropped out. And at least in the districts that we're working with, teachers have the freedom to drop out. And the administration can encourage people to go, but if the teachers don't see value, they are free to not go. And in one instance, that's what happened. And so, I can accept responsibility in that I should have maintained in closer contact with the administration as well as with the teachers to try and form a stronger partnership right from the get-go. One of the other things I did was I did have letters of support from teachers to participate in the development process, and these were teachers who had participated in a prior grant of mine, of which some of those teachers were the same teachers who then dropped out. And so I think the fact that it didn't fit their needs was key. The other thing that we're actually doing is, as I just recently, actually yesterday, I wrote an email to one of the district administrators saying, you know, we have this unit that's been developed. I'm doing some other PD with him. Can I share it with you? And can we work with you to actually begin to recruit teachers into the thing? So I've gone back to that district to see if I can actually get additional teachers, and we'll see.
Yeah.
I think at least for me, with the teachers that I've been working with and the districts that I've been working with, it's a case-by-case basis. Sometimes admins are strongly involved, other times
Let's take I-96 east at US.
they take I-96.
Turn right.
Thank you.
I think turning left would probably be more appropriate, but yeah. Yeah.
Barbara, in some ways that question anticipated my question, which was in listening to your description of the communities of practice.
Yes.
Your description sounded to me very ethnographic,
Uh-huh.
as if you were merely an observer and you were watching autonomous agents make decisions, right? And I think that's a values question, right? You just said right now, I think I should have been more involved in staying closer contact, but that is a value judgment that you need to make, and it's an allocation of resource,
Yes.
your time and effort or somebody else's time and effort and money. How do you think about that balance? Is it your place to actually, you know, interject yourself,
So-
or do you honor the autonomy?
So it's actually really interesting in that I played different roles with different groups. So the high school teachers, I took a step back, and actually my co-PI was more involved with that group. I was heavily involved, or I was involved with the middle grades group. And the elementary one is really just forming, and so I sort of here and there. And I don't know if it was me making that decision based on resources, you know, time and things of that sort, or if it was me wanting to give teachers space. I don't know my rationale.
If you were, I think this way a lot, if you were to come up with an analogy for what a community of practice would it be a coral reef? Would it be a tree or a chicken? Or would it be a house or a ship? Or is there some other analogy that you would make in terms of describing a community of practice?
I mean, a coral reef might actually be a good one in the sense that
It's competition.
coral reef isn't competition.
Sure they are.
It's an environment.
Oh, yeah,
They're-
other fishes eat other fishes.
But the whole environment is sustained until something else happens externally that causes things to implode.
And I'm thinking that a coral reef is made up of millions of
Right,
individual
right,
polyps,
yeah.
who don't necessarily have a master plan for what they're doing, but they react to their particular environment. But, I mean,
Yeah, I'd have to think.
analogy is supposed to be whatever you
I'd have to think about that, but I think in order to be successful, the community practice does have to have a shared goal. And I think that either, you know, as a grant writer and developer as such, you know, I need to make certain that whatever I'm writing about aligns with the goals of, or the needs as such, of what teachers are. Or I need to go find new teachers to actually do that in that sense. Or I need to be willing to be flexible in the goals of the grant to actually get, that match has to happen at some level, I think.
So I was wondering, one thing I find interesting is we know that professional learning isn't just one and
Right,
done, that it
right.
needs to be sustained. And so we're working on creating communities of practice, but then once the project ends, how do you maintain, or how do you maintain, I mean, you were talking about that now looking forward, but also then how do you create new communities of practice that support that?
Right.
I think
So one of the things that makes me cautiously optimistic in regards to your question is, for this particular project, is that for whatever reason, I've gotten involved now with ISTA, the Illinois State Science Association. And they are really interested right now in that question that you're posing of, how do you actually provide professional development and develop these networks, and which is different than a community of practice, but think about communities of practice across the state. And so I think by partnering with organizations like that, that's one way to begin that path. The other group that I've been talking about in the state of Illinois through the regional offices of education. And some of those regional offices are also beginning to think about how do you actually develop professional learning communities, PLCs is what they're calling them, to actually support teachers in this idea. And so that's another thing. But yeah, I agree.
Well, I'm going to pay attention to time. I'm sure Barbara will stick around more. There is a postdoc graduate luncheon right after this, so if you're a postdoc or graduate student, you can go and ask Barbara questions then. But she is a good communicator, so I'm sure she'll be more than willing to stick around, talk to you, or answer your email or whatever. So anyways, let's give Barbara another big round of applause.
Thank you.
And we have our little gift for Barbara, a little card. So there we go. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Joe.